Welcome to the 16th chapter of our course and to modern times, the times that are the closest from everything we learned until now to what we experience today. We are going to now learn about the Jewish movements and denominations that developed in the 18th, 19th century in East and West Europe, and that really describe a lot of what we will see around Israel and around the Jewish world in the 21st century. So we will begin with the 18th century in East Europe, and with the beginning of a movement called Hasidism, Chasidut in Hebrew. And let's start with a little background of how this movement came to life and became so influential in such a short time period. First of all, we talked about the Jews coming to East Europe already from the 12th century and on, and East Europe being the largest Jewish population in the world. And this population did not live very comfortably. They lived mainly in villages, very poor. It wasn't such a huge success if you were a peasant in East Europe and not Jewish, and it was even worse to be Jewish. If you were also not Jewish, it was pretty hard to be a farmer, to grow your crops, to get enough potatoes and food for your family. It was a lot of hard work. But if you're Jewish, you also are limited by different restrictions, not being able to own land many times, restricted to specific economical developments that the governor, the noble person who owned the land needed, and also many times under attacks of your neighbors. It was very difficult in East Europe. And not only was it difficult objectively, the cold winters, the low income, the need to support for one family, but also very little meaning and very little connection to leadership. The leadership, the people who were considered the leaders of community, were of two types. One, people who were landlords, who had the money, who could afford a nicer lifestyle, and another kind of leader was the rabbi, who was a very learned person, who could find his way through all the Jewish bookshelf that we talked about, knew it by heart many times, and could argue every side of a discussion of a Talmudic page. And the person that is in hard labor all day to get enough potatoes for his family did not really have a common language with these scholars of Talmud, of Jewish text. Religiously, it was considered that the way to God goes through the learning of the words of God, meaning to be an expert of all these endless texts, to know the Torah, to know the Tanakh, to know the Mishnah, to know the Talmud. Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov is the name he's well known for. His full name is Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer. The Baal Shem Tov was a preaching rabbi, going from city to city and lifting up the spirits of the people, even healing certain diseases, speaking words of wisdom mainly to the scholars. He was a great scholar himself, but he was able to talk about the spiritual meaning of every individual, about the spiritual evolution. Israel Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, or as he's known, Baal Shem Tov. These are the words, this is the name you should remember for the founder of a movement of Chasidut, of Hasidism. Baal Shem Tov, a preaching rabbi who would go from community to community and uplift the spirituality of the people who came to hear him. He was a great scholar himself, and many scholars were attracted to him, as he talked not only about the intellectual side of the deep learning, but about the spiritual being that is being uplifted by the learning, and about messages that were not all that common in the world of his time. Baal Shem Tov also talked about the value of spiritual connection even without knowledge. Maybe as an introduction to Chassidut, the best way would be to tell a story, because the way Chassidut works and is able to come to every individual many times is by stories. So the story goes about Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, that he came to a little village on the high holidays. He came for Yom Kippur. And in that village, there was a little kid who never really got the reading and writing part. The letters kind of didn't fit. It didn't work for him. He didn't read. And he was considered a failure. When all of his kids, of his friends went and studied in the cheder and the school and could pray properly and could take part in the community, he stayed behind. He went to work because he wasn't able to read and write. And when comes Yom Kippur, and all the congregants are so excited, dressed in white, coming to synagogue, and this is not like any other Yom Kippur. This is Yom Kippur when Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov came for a visit, and he will pray with us, and everybody is full of excitement going to synagogue, but this little kid is not, because he doesn't know how to read from the prayer book, from the Machzor, and he's used to not going to synagogue, so he stays out, doesn't even dress up, and all the congregations come to the important prayer of Kol Nidrei that opens the highest day of the year, and this little kid stands outside the synagogue. And then there are different versions to the story. We'll stick to the one that he starts whistling. A whistle that comes out of his soul, out of his heart, and he says, God, my Father in heavens, what can I do? I don't know how to talk to you. This is what I do know how to do, so I'm giving you this whistle. And he starts a very loud whistle. And the people in the service that just began, the most important prayer of a year almost, want to hush him down, and Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov says, don't dare. Don't interrupt this child. I'll open a parenthesis and share that we have descriptions of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov in his prayer. And in his prayer, he's going into an ecstatic mode. He is described in his prayer as coming into a shaking that is almost uncontrolled, like a bull before slaughter. And after his prayers, he would describe to his students all these different worlds that he saw in his prayer. I'm closing this side, Mark. I'm coming back to our story. After the prayer, the students come to Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov and ask him, how could you allow that kid, that brat, to interrupt the prayer? And Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov answers, interrupt? When I was praying, I was in higher worlds, beyond this one. And I saw all your prayers coming up to the gates of heaven, but not quite making it. And then came that pure intention of the heart of that child and lifted up all of your prayers together to the gates of heaven. Coming out of this story, and of course, you may think Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw things or did not see things, that is not the main point. The main point is this Hasidic story comes to talk about different set of values. This story says you can be illiterate. You can be completely ignorant, but with the right intention of heart, with the right kavanah, that is the term, you can be in a higher spiritual level than the biggest scholars. This is a revolutionary concept, saying that the intention of the heart can give you an authentic religious experience, even if you're not very learned. It can bring you close to God. You need the right guide. You need the right leader, the right rabbi, who does know a lot and can direct you in the right path and can bring to you what you need from the endless sea of information. But everybody can achieve a deep, meaningful, religious experience and connection to God. So this is a difference in the religious experience. It's also a difference in values, because if the main value of a religious experience and of society until now was the learning, the intellectual experience, now the inner intention and what you feel inside and your spiritual experience comes even before learning. One might say even before the commandment itself at times. That is what the opposition of Chassidut said about it, as we will see soon. There's also a huge social revolution. Until Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, if you were born in a specific community, your leader was the rabbi of the community. And the rich people, if I were a Rothschild, I maybe would be able to be with them, but if not, not. So you were forced to live in a specific society just by circumstances, with a specific leader just by circumstances. You didn't choose your rabbi. But Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov and his students, and the students of his students, will move between villages, inspire people, and then go back to their hometown. And if someone was inspired by one of them, he can then go on a holiday or for Shabbat to the hometown of the inspiring rabbi and spend Shabbat together, spend a holiday together. And then, full of inspiration, go back to his daily life. When he will go to this inspiring rabbi, to what will be called in Chassidut Vet Tzaddik, he will meet many other people who were inspired by similar ideas. And now he is part of a voluntarily belonging to a community, to a leader that was not forced upon him, but was his or her choice. So this is a revolution that changes society, that changes the concept of religion, that changes the concept of values and the concept of leadership. And if you remember, all these were challenged not long ago by a false messiah called Shabtai Tzvi. Jewish society is still traumatized by winds of change, by challenging all the traditional order. And when the Chassidut challenges the traditional orders of religion and society and community, an opposition, and a very strong opposition, will stand in front of it. The greatest scholar, great rabbi, Kabbalist of the time is called the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Elijah from Vilna. And he will declare war over this new movement of Chassidut, which is led by not only Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, but also his close students and their students are leading now this movement and communities around East Europe. And the Vilna Gaon writes against them, attacks them, boycotts them from the Jewish community. A very difficult time for anyone who was a Hasid, because they were persecuted by the mainstream Jewish community, led by the Vilna Gaon. They were boycotted, which has huge influences on a family, on an individual that chose to belong to Hasidut. The opposers to Hasidut, in Hebrew, mitnaged, and in the Ashkenazi pronunciation, the taf and samech, the t and the s kind of switch. So in English you would call them the misnagdim or the Lithuanian, Litaim, because they followed the Vilna Gaon, who was from Lithuania. So the Lithuanian Jews, the misnagdim, are opposing these concepts of Hasidut and believe in following the traditional, intellectual, hard work way, that only after you learned a certain sum of halacha, of the classic books that we talked about, Tanakh, Mishnah, Talmud, and so on, will you be coming into the mystic learning and into the religious experience, which should be very subtle, very careful. And that is a very different way from the way that Hasidut will be more and more into really starting many times from the experience and then going to the learning, and fitting an experience for every person, no matter where he is. So these are two different philosophies. One is with a larger focus on the intellect, and the other is a larger focus on the emotion. Also the way prayers look like. In Hasidut, you'll often have meditation before prayer, preparing yourself, and often taking a long time on every word and word in order to make sure you feel what you say. And in Lithuanian Judaism, the focus will be more on the law, on halacha, on doing what you should do. You can feel nicer about it, not as nice about it, but we are worshiping God. So the question of what you feel that moment is not always the most relevant question. When you see a lot of dancing and singing in prayer, that will be Hasidut. You will not see it as much in a Lithuanian service or prayer. So two different philosophies of Judaism developing in East Europe of the 18th century. You can say that the Misnagdim is a continuation of the traditional European way of thought about Judaism, and there's the revolutionizing Hasidut. Two different philosophies, a boycott and an actual war in the 18th century, which will end after the death of Vilna Gaon. His successor, Rabbi Chaim from Volozhin, will remove the boycott, say we do not agree with them, but they're definitely not heretics. We even can learn a few things from them. And also the Hasidut will become more with a focus on the intellect and the learning, and there are different kinds of Hasidut that you will find until today. As every rabbi who is a student or a student of a student or a student of a student of a student and so on of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, developed his own specific philosophy under the umbrella of Hasidut. So you will find many kinds of Hasidim. You will find Chabad, one of the most famous Hasidut, that was founded by the student of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Shneur Zalman from Ladi. You can also find Belz and Satmar and Breslov. If you see people dancing and singing in the streets and with loudspeakers in the car, that's usually the people who follow Rabbi Nachman from Breslov. That's also a kind of Hasidut, and he was the grandchild of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov. So you can recognize the Breslov Hasidim by the white hats with a kind of a some ball in the middle. So we have different kinds of Hasidut. Almost all Hasidim, with the exception of Chabad, will wear long coats on Shabbat and fair hats. Only Chabad is an exception to that from all the Hasidim. There's a misconception that is often made between Hasidim and Charedim. We will explain the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox perspective very soon, but just so we know, it is not the same as the word Hasid. You have Lithuanian, Misnagdi, Haredi Jews. Actually, the majority of Haredi Jews are Mitnagdim, are opposers of Hasidut, and also Hasidim. So that will be explained later on. We are staying in the 18th century, but now moving from East Europe to West Europe, which is a totally different culture. West Europe of the 18th century is the age of enlightenment. I'm not talking about Judaism, I'm talking about the world of West Europe, which is transformed from the Middle Ages. Let's just take a bit of background to come into the picture. The 16th century, the period of the Renaissance, you have theologically opposition to the Catholic Church. You have Martin Luther writing 95 theses against the Catholic Church and protesting and actually building a new movement in Christianity called the Protestant Christians that believe you can be critical and that every person can use their own mind, have free access to the Bible and not need any mediators. That freedom to challenge authority and to use your mind will continue to mind boggle the world. If you look at the 17th century, so you have, for example, Descartes in France that will say, I don't believe anything you taught me. All I know is that here I'm asking the question, I think, therefore I am. And from here I'll build my logic and common sense and understanding of the world, but I will do it myself with my mind. And these streams in philosophy, in art, in theology, will come to a peak in the 18th and 19th century. In the 18th century is an age that is called the Enlightenment, which puts the human mind as a top value. Immanuel Kant, a philosopher in Germany of that time, will say, enlightenment is just dare use your brains, dare use your own mind. You can challenge everything. In that concept, worth asking, until now we considered Jews to be unwanted, stereotyped, demonized. In the 18th century, if a Jewish person has clever things to say, we can hear them because we have an open mind and we don't prejudge, at least according to the values of this time. Of course, people will always also prejudge. And the example of a well-known philosopher of the time who is Jewish is Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn was an observant, traditional Jew, and one of the highest, most appreciated philosophers of the time in Germany. He won competitions and awards. He even came before Immanuel Kant in a Prussian contest for the best scientific article. Moses Mendelssohn was offered to be a head of the Cathedral of Philosophy in Germany. Only there was one problem. He had to convert to Christianity for that. Because although the perspective in art and culture and philosophy changed, the law did not change yet. Jews were not equal by law. The priest, you see in the picture, his name is Lavater. And Lavater attacked his friend Mendelssohn in the newspaper, saying, Moses Mendelssohn is one of the smartest people I've ever met. I don't understand how he can be Jewish. Mendelssohn was deeply offended. He didn't like to talk about his religion in the public sphere, where he talked mainly about philosophy, but because of that article, he sat down to write a book of Jewish philosophy, explaining the sense, logic, and philosophy of Judaism. The book is called Jerusalem. He also translated the Torah to German. So also many Jews that are now more assimilated into German society will be able to stay connected to their tradition, as he himself was very traditional also in this translation, and kept fully the Jewish commandments. That cannot be said about his children. 2 of them stayed Jewish, or his grandchildren, 1 stayed Jewish. And I'm not saying this about Moses Mendelssohn personally. I'm saying this about generations of this new period of time. This time where Jews become more and more accepted into the general society. Also after Mendelssohn passed away, Jews start to get equal rights. This starts with the French Revolution, because equality, freedom, brotherhood, to all? Who is exactly all? That is a question that comes up. Also feminism will start at that point, because the question is, who is equal? A question that will continue echoing into the 20th century. Is equality to all mankind? Is equality to the Jews? Asks Napoleon. And in every site like Jaffa, Akko, Haifa, that you go to and see relics from Napoleon, you can also raise this issue, that Napoleon really changed the Jewish world. Napoleon is in charge to a lot of the development of Jewish denominations that will come later on. Napoleon brings together 70 Jewish leaders, rabbis, businessmen, lay leaders. What does the number 70 mean? You're right, the Sanhedrin. On his perspective, he's regathering the Jewish Sanhedrin, and he asked them a series of questions. And the bottom line of these questions, he's seeking for an understanding, what is the Jewish identity? Are you Jews, a nation that happened to sit on the land of France, but a separate nation, or French people with a separate, different religion? And that is their answer to Napoleon. We are French. We speak French. We read French literature. We will fight for the values of the revolution. We are just as French citizens as our Christian neighbor. Our religion is the religion of Moses. It's the Jewish religion. And Napoleon, understanding this answer, gives for the first time equal rights in France. 1789. The next year also South France will get equal rights. Emancipation. 6 years later, 1796, Holland will be now governed by Napoleon's brother. And also there, Jews get equal rights. And into the 19th century, it's a process where more and more Jews get equal rights, and not only equal philosophically, but are now able to participate fully in the general Christian society. And this invitation of being part of the modern world, part of the modern way of thinking, is an invitation that the great majority of Jews will be very happy to take. And, of course, still being Jewish. Not all. Many will just respond by embracing the general world and leaving Judaism. That is called assimilation. It will be very, very big at this time. As the more emancipation is full, and Jews are a part of society, many times they will choose to be a full part of society and convert to Christianity either for reasons of faith or just reasons of convenience. The peak of this process of emancipation, of being a full part of society, we can see in Italy and England at the beginning of the 20th century, where you'll have a Jewish prime minister. And that requires being a full part of society, a full part of a modern world, if you want to participate. And then the question comes up. If you do not assimilate and do stay with your Jewish identity, how you connect these two identities? The modern identity that is now offered and opened to every Jewish person in Europe, West Europe that is, and the Jewish identity. These are two very strong powers. We are all part of modern, global identities, way of thought, and also part, and no matter where you come from, and if you're Jewish or not Jewish, you're part of a very long chain of collective memory, of identity, carrying treasures of culture, of faith for 3,000 years. Do you just let them go? Leave them behind? How do you balance these two? Your Jewish identity and faith on one hand, and on the other hand, being part of a modern world. And what we will be talking about now is Jewish denominations, which will differ upon that balance exactly, upon how you balance the modern world and your Jewish faith and identity. And I would like to start with Rabbi Dr. Abraham Geiger. When I say Rabbi Doctor, which will be the title that almost every founder of a stream of thought denomination here in West Europe will have, it means that he comes from two worlds. Rabbi means he was traditionally ordained. He was also a commentator on the Mishnah and wrote a translation to the Mishnah, and he was tested on the Shulchan Aruch. He knows Jewish law, practices Jewish law, and he's a doctor of philosophy from the University of Heidelberg. He's well acquainted with the modern way of thought. Rabbi Dr. Abraham Geiger started his career actually as a rabbi assistant in a synagogue. And as a rabbi assistant, he could also hear all the talk going on between the people in the synagogue that are often very bored from the rabbi's sermon that is given in Yiddish, which is a language which is a combination of German and Hebrew and doesn't have aesthetics of either language, which is pure grammar of that specific language. And many of the listeners do not feel it's especially relevant. And the great majority of the people praying do not understand a word they're saying in Hebrew. And as they talk among themselves, they also ask themselves, what are they doing there? And actually, I just passed by the church with my friend Heinrich the other day, and wow, let me tell you, that was uplifting. And the music and the organ and the beauty. Why can't we have an aesthetic, uplifting spiritual experience when we come to synagogue? Rabbi Dr. Abraham Geiger, with another group of rabbis, decided to sit and seriously ask questions about, are we where we want to be? if the general society is now emancipating Jews and fixing our social situation, do we not also need to look in the mirror and fix things that kind of deteriorated in ourselves? He asks. Of course, the Jewish world led the rest of the world into these ideas of enlightenment, of humanity, of monotheism, and of social justice. And all of a sudden, it feels like we're behind and they're leading. Should we not think of our role in the modern world? Should we not ask the questions about the goals of Judaism? And are we fulfilling them or not? What are the goals of the Torah of Judaism? It doesn't matter even if you're Jewish or which denomination you belong to within Judaism. It's a symbol. What are the goals of the holy books, of the faith for a human being? The answers we will get are usually two. One is to create a role model society, a society of justice, a society of truth, honesty, of grace and care for one another and to the weak. How we treat one another, morality, that is one goal, the social goal. And there's a theological goal too, saying that if man was created in the image of God, so he can't just be with the animal instinct or only with the physical instincts, but he can connect to higher spiritual levels. And religion is supposed to give a person the tools to do that, to connect to his Creator. And now, since most Jews will agree on these goals, the rabbis, that Rabbi Dr. Abraham Geiger is considered the founder of this stream of thought, of reforming, of rethinking, start to look at the details of a practice and ask, does this practice serve these greater goals? The answer will be, we can argue, we can think, because everything is open for thought. Dare use your mind. That is the slogan of these times, if you remember. So, for example, is it right to use Hebrew, which nobody understands in Germany of the 19th century, as the language to speak to your Creator? Different opinions. Some say, yes, it touches deep places in my heart, in my collective memory, knowing that I'm using the same words that my father and great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather used. These words that I heard from childhood touch me in a way I cannot explain. Some others will say, no. If I can say please in my own language and thank you in my own language, it is far more meaningful. But this discussion becomes legitimate. Using music, an organ like the church, which is for spiritual uplifting. Is it legitimate on Shabbat? Is the practice, is the rule of not playing music on Shabbat still serve the goal? It may have 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, but does it serve the goal today? These will be questions that will be asked and will be answered. This way of thought, of asking question, will spread out from Germany to West Europe, to the United States. There'll be, you can still visit today, the West London Synagogue with an amazing, huge, beautiful organ. Over there, it was established by Ashkenazi Jews from Germany together with Jews that came from Portugal after the expulsion of Spain, that wanted to be British Jews, modern British Jews, and fulfill the Judaism and feel a full part of the modern world. in the United States, in 1875, is opened the college, the seminar for training Reform rabbis, the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Already the first students graduated. 1883, the end of the 19th century, we have Reform rabbis teaching, leading communities in the United States, and coming together and building a platform, the Pittsburgh Platform, in 1885, of what Reform Judaism believes in. Since 1885, many more platforms were made, many of them very similar. Many of the rulings, of course, there are a whole set of topics that will be addressed in these platforms. Some stayed very similar, some changed. Things changed since the 19th century. It is not important in this frame for us to know all the evolution since the 19th century until the 21st. It is super important to understand main principles in the philosophy, theology of Reform Jews. As we'll explain later, Reform Judaism is the largest belonging to a synagogue and self-definition of religion among Jews. We'll talk about statistics, but if a Jew defines himself a religious Jew in the United States today, it means most probable he is a Reform Jew. And that will be the majority also of the tourists who come to Israel to celebrate Bar Mitzvah or to have a trip following the Jewish identity. Reform and conservative will definitely be the majority, and we'll talk about conservative Jews soon. So we need, first of all, to know about the Jewish world as we're guiding in the Jewish country, and we need to explain a little bit of Jewish philosophy. But not only that, we are guiding Jewish tourists. And in order to give a good, relevant guiding and to offer the appropriate sites and messages and places to pray, we need to have a better understanding also of the tourist. So we'll talk about a few principles in Reform Judaism. First one, which is very important, is equality between all human beings, that we're all created in the image of God, regardless of race, faith, gender. Universalism. The understanding that we treat in dignity every person and try to help. Tikkun olam, that mystic idea that we saw earlier, is something that you will find in every Reform congregation. And in the itinerary of every Reform trip, you'll usually find, and not only in Reform trips, it is very popular today, where do we try to make the world a better place for you and for me and for the entire human race? So that is the idea of equality. And of course, no discrimination between men and women. The feminist ideas, which are part, thank God, since the 20th century, of a Western modern world, and are also a full part of the Reform movement, and anything that a man can do in leadership and in participation, a woman and any other gender preference can also take part. So that is one very important core principle of full equality. Another very important principle would be autonomous choice. In rituals that are not between people, not the rituals that serve the goal of a moral society, that are just as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. But rituals that were relevant 3,000 and 2,000 years ago, but are not necessarily relevant today. Some are definitely not, like sacrifices. The Reform movement is not praying to return to sacrifice animals in the temple in Jerusalem. And regarding a lot of rituals that are part of the relationship between man and God, the principle in Reform Judaism since the 19th century until today is autonomous choice. For example, the law, which is not a law between people, a law between man and God, is a law that you cannot light a fire on Shabbat, and therefore you cannot drive on Shabbat. And in Reform Judaism, you can make that choice. Does that serve your relationship with God in the 21st century? Or was that a detail that served a goal thousands of years ago and today does not? What kind of food you eat? Does everything have to be strict kosher? Same philosophy. Check. If keeping kosher uplifts you spirituality and enables you to preserve and remember your connection to God, absolutely keep kosher. If you find it's just a burden which adds nothing to your religious experience, forget it. That is the concept of autonomous choice. So we will find that Reform Jews are less obliged by halakha. They're not obliged by halakha. Their recommendation is to know Jewish law, to find it inspiring in many ways as what goals it serves, and at times choose to also follow it. But it is not an obligation. Reform rabbi will usually consult you and not give you what we call in Hebrew psak, an order of a ruling of what you have to do according to Jewish law. But again, that has to do with everything that is ritual, that is ben adam lamakom, between man and God. Everything that is between people, all the Jewish law that has to do with theft, crime, honesty, and everything, of course, is just as relevant and obliging as it was 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. So, those were a few words about Reform Judaism, and in the balance between being part of modern thought and the modern world and preserving Jewish tradition, the Reform Judaism is considered more inclined to the modern way of thinking and giving it a preference to human values and the modern way of thought than on the account of a lot of Jewish tradition, and especially, as we said, the obligation of halakha. To many Jews, these ideas are very foreign and sound very far from the Judaism they know. And one of these Jews in the 19th century, and all the 4 Jewish denominations that I will introduce here are West and Central Europe, beginning of the 19th century. So if you're asked, since when we have Reform, Haredi, modern Orthodox, conservative Jews, your answer is always from the beginning of the 19th century, West and Central Europe. The only reason I add Central Europe is because of this gentleman over here, Khatam Sofer, who lived in Hungary of the 19th century. And Khatam Sofer sees what's happening in the Jewish world, sees assimilation, sees the liberal Judaism, sees Jews that lose their interest to Judaism in favor of belonging to the modern world. And Khatam Sofer, so disappointed from what is happening to Judaism, he chooses not to participate in this encounter, to try to avoid the meeting with the modern world as much as possible. Khatam Sofer quotes Isaiah 66. And I put it here in Hebrew too because of a word that appears here, charedim. שמעו דבר אדוני החרדים אל דברו. אמרו אחיכם, שונאיכם, מנדיכם, למען שמי יכבד אדוני ונראה בשמחתכם והם יבושו. Of course, translations are always a little poor, not as good as the original. Chared in Hebrew means terrified, afraid. Hear the word of the Lord, you who are concerned. The translation here about his word. So Charedi means worried, concerned, afraid. For what? What are you concerned about? The word of God in this world. The Charedi perspective is that we have been carrying the most precious treasure of mankind for over 3,000 years, the divine revelation. In the Torah, the written Torah, and the oral Torah. The recipe that God gave mankind to live properly and to fulfill your destiny in this world. Will we let go of it for baseball caps, Coca-Cola, globalization? And the answer is no. Khatam Sofer will say, Chadash asur min haTorah. The new is not allowed from the Torah. That is a quote from the Mishnah that talks about new fruit. But he is saying, no, thank you. I don't need the modern values. I don't trust the wisdom of the West. And I believe that the wisdom in the little details of the way my grandparents talk, do things, obey the Jewish tradition, there's deeper, broader wisdom than all the professors of Heidelberg. And all the humanity and new values they talk about is a fashion that will show its real face later, maybe. Very little trust in the wisdom of the world, and full trust that all the wisdom we need is in our religious scriptures, in the divine revelation. So that is the Haredi philosophy. What's that? Hope that doesn't continue. Maybe everything will collapse on me in a second. The Haredi philosophy is a response to an outside threat. It didn't come from inside. It is not like the argument between Chassidut and Misnagdim. That was a philosophical, theological argument within the Jewish community, which came from inside, from an inner problem, from a question of values. Here, Khatam Sofer is responding to an outside threat. And in the balance between the modern world and Jewish tradition, he chooses to put Jewish tradition in the highest priority and the modern world in the lowest priority. This choice has nothing to do with the question if you're a Chassid or Lithuanian. Khatam Sofer himself was Lithuanian, a Misnaged. He was not a Chassid. But many Chassidim will find his perspective about all the wisdom being within Judaism, about rejecting the modern world, very appealing. Therefore, you have in the Haredi world of today, and those who follow that approach towards the walls we need to build around our tradition in order to maintain it in the global modern world, you will find within these walls both Lithuanian and Hasidim. And as the elections this year show, both in the municipality and in the Knesset, and they always show it, they're not always in agreement, but they're all Charedim. They have a similar perspective to the modern world, not always a similar perspective regarding Jewish issues. So majority of the Haredi world is Lithuanian. You can usually distinguish by the way they dress on Shabbat and holidays. We mentioned it before. Lithuanian Charedim, in the same concept of not changing too much of your fashion, but maintaining the same fashion, the same language that your ancestors had, and not being influenced over time. But the Lithuanian Jews have an update from the beginning of the 20th century. So they have short suits and kind of classic hats that you can also see in movies from the time. And the Hasidic Jews kind of stay in the 19th century in the fashion. So they have longer coats and the fur hats. And one exception I made before is the Chabad Hasidism that is more similar to the Lithuanian look, although they are Hasidim. So those were a few words about 14% of the Jewish population in Israel that, of course, we need to explain. So when we explain the appearance, which is very visual, of Haredi Jews, so this is the story we tell. With one exception, side locks, that we'll talk later. Side locks is from the Torah. But wearing coats and fur hats in the summer of Israel is something we can explain by that rejection. That is a well-known phenomenon in the world too. Like the Amish in the States, it's a choice of how you wish to live your life. What is your lifestyle? What is your value system? And their choice is to maintain the way of the ancestors and not to be constantly influenced by the changing fashion of the modern world. So until now we spoke about Reform Judaism and about Haredi Judaism. Two more left. Are you ready? If you want to take a break, feel free. We won't make it an official break, but you have a pause button. And we will now go to Rabbi Dr. Zecharia Frenkel. Rabbi Dr. Zecharia Frenkel, first of all, you can tell me he was both ordained as an Orthodox rabbi and a doctor from university, doctor of philosophy, a great philosopher, and a very influential rabbi with a big community in Germany. And he was a friend also of Rabbi Abraham Geiger. These people all know each other. And he joined that group of rabbis to begin with. He authorized the prayer book, the Siddur, that Abraham Geiger prepared for his community, with reforms, with changes. He was for thinking forward, thinking of change, progressing. But when he joined this group of rabbis, and he gave a speech about positive historism, being committed to history but positive and progressive. And he got applause from all the reforming rabbis. But as they came up and spoke, he felt they do not understand him. The meaning of commitment to history and commitment to the present. Rabbi Zecharia Frenkel, although he was all for taking in modern way of thinking and participating in the modern world fully, he was against the dramatic changes in halakha, which is the base of Jewish identity, to his perspective, to the Jewish connection within the peoplehood in the present, and the Jewish commitment to the peoplehood of the past. Historism means commitment to our history and our collective identity, which came to pass through halakha and through the halachic discussion, as we learned together. So how do you do both? Live in the modern world and remain loyal to your identity and obligation of halakha. We will see two examples, two denominations that answer this question. One is the conservative Judaism, founded by Rabbi Dr. Zecharia Frankel. Conservative will be kind of the American adaptation of a philosophy of Rabbi Dr. Zecharia Frankel. And then we'll talk also about the modern Orthodox. We could say, if we go back to the Shulchan Aruch, who wrote it? Trying to remember. Thank you, right. Rabbi Yosef Karo. Where? Tzfat of the 16th century. Coming back to the Shulchan Aruch, does it oblige Rabbi Dr. Zecharia Frankel? Does it oblige a conservative Jew? The answer is yes, except for one page. The last back cover. The statement, and even if you didn't get that metaphor, forget it and just move on with me. The idea that the discussion is closed. The Mishnah has an authority over the Talmud, who has an authority over Maimonides, who has an authority over the Shulchan Aruch and Jewish law, but the discussion never stops. And the objection of conservative Judaism to Orthodox Judaism is the feeling as if they stopped the discussion, which was always ongoing and alive, and updated to current situation in interpretation to past decisions, with full respect to their authority. I'll give you an example, because it is a little complicated and abstract. There's a question that is very relevant today. Can women lead prayer? There's another question. Can men and women sit together in a synagogue? What does the Shulchan Aruch say? Can a woman lead prayer? The Shulchan Aruch says no. But Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote another book, Bet Yosef, in which he explains the reasons for every ruling. And in the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo says the reason a woman cannot lead prayer is because it would be disrespectful to the public. Because if a woman would be a leader in the 16th century, it means probably the public is illiterate and cannot lead the prayer himself, and that would be not respecting the public. So, with the respect to the authority of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and with the respect of the right of scholars in our times to continue the discussion, the leading rabbis of the conservative movement in our times will say, we accept the authority of Yosef Karo, and if he was with us in the discussion today, he would say, today it is disrespectful that a woman that can be prime minister, doctor, lawyer, cannot take a full part in worship and in leading of prayer. So the argument is not autonomous choice. The argument will be within the framework of halachic discussion. Same with participation in prayer. We'll go back to the Talmud, and also in conservative Judaism, another legitimate tool in the halachic discussion is science. If science has a say, which is new to us, we can take it into the halachic discussion. For example, in Jewish law, a man who committed suicide cannot be buried together with his family, for example, in the cemetery. He needs to have a separate section, which is, of course, difficult when the family comes to mourn and to visit someone who committed suicide. Acknowledging that difficulty, the conservative movement will come and say, we can use today science that we didn't have in the past, psychology, which determines that a man that committed suicide did not necessarily commit a sin because he's already defined insane, usually beforehand, and therefore is not responsible for his sin of taking his own life, and therefore we do not need to punish him in the way of kind of excommunicating him in the cemetery. Because in halachic discussions, if a person is insane or has some kind of misjudgment that is not his own fault, there is a way to permit him to be buried with everybody. So it's a combination of modern science, and all is good, also archaeology. You want to find out if there was a women's section in the times of the Talmud, you'll both read the Talmud, which does not talk about such things, and also go to archaeology. Check out synagogues. With the initial understanding that halakha has an authority on us, but we are a part of the discussion, just like the previous generations were. So that is kind of a balance between belonging in the modern world and being a part, another link in the chain of Jewish Judaism on the conservative movement's part. So if we want to summarize it, we can say, are they open to the modern world? Absolutely. Are they open to the modern world in the way we learn and practice religion? Yes. We need to review the religion and all the tools that our mind can find. Obligated to halakha? Yes. Often a different interpretation of halakha than the Orthodox Jews. This leaves us with one more Jewish denomination, and last one for this chapter. By the way, I am not talking about Reconstructionist Judaism, which is fascinating, established by Mordechai Kaplan. Not because it's not important, not because it's not interesting, but because it's a minor group, although the fastest growing, but it's still a very little group in the Jewish world, and the likelihood of you to guide specifically a Reconstructionist group is lower. So that is the reason why we're not dedicating time to them. The next person that I want to introduce you to is Rabbi Dr. Samson Raphael Hirsch, Rabbi Hirsch, who is considered the founder of modern Orthodoxy. He is a friend of the Chatam Sofer. He knows also Abraham Geiger and Zecharia Frankel and deeply disagrees and even boycotts the Reform Jews. He demands, together with 77 other rabbis, to be recognized by the German government as a separate community from the Reform Jews. In his eyes, what they do is leaving Judaism. He writes to the Chatam Sofer, the one who established the Haredi way of thought, that he agrees with him. And Rabbi Hirsch, unlike the Chatam Sofer, went to university. He knows what he would agree to reject. But he says to the Chatam Sofer, what you can do in Hungary, I cannot do in Germany. I have a big congregation. But if I will say here what you say there, I will be speaking to the walls. Because my congregants are all working, learning in Germany, a full part of the modern world. And I need to find the balance where we can continue to live our lives as Jews here in Germany. And you have all my blessings for your way in Hungary. And Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch is also famous for the slogan, Torah im derech eretz. Torah with the ways of earth, with the ways of the land. And he himself went to university, and he was all for getting a profession, going to school. But as a parallel line to your full commitment to the unchangeable, eternal Jewish identity, Jewish law and Torah. In the same philosophy that we gave before of the Charedim, saying we have a 3,000+ year old treasure that we are carrying and passing from generation to generation. We have to keep it and not allow any passing fashion to affect the way we observe the words of God. Yes, we can learn, we can enjoy this world, we can and should get a proper profession to provide for our families. But don't let these professors to teach you about your Judaism and to affect the way you observe Jewish law. Of course, everything I say is a bit of a generalization, but there will be very little difference between the way that modern Orthodox observe halakha and the way that ultra-Orthodox Charedim observe halakha. Almost no difference. They both follow Shulchan Aruch as is. And the same restrictions that would be added by Charedim will be added by modern Orthodox. No change. Modernity, we're open to it in our daily lives, but we're not open to modernity to influence and lighten our commitment to the Word of God and to the halachic commandments. Modern Orthodoxy in Israel is influenced by the philosophy and theology of Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Kohen Kook, or in short, Rabbi Kook. Rabbi Kook, in the 20th century, was the one who was considered the founder of religious Zionism. Again, a combination between religion, orthodoxy. Orthodoxy means the straight path. And Zionism, which is a national modern movement. Also a response to this balance between Jewish identity and modern world. Being part of a modern world by nationality, which is a modern concept, and not part of all the religious aspects of Judaism. But religious Zionist means I'm both Zionist and religious. Religious Zionist actually combines the two as they affect each other. Modern Orthodoxy is more like two parallel lines, but it is important to introduce. Because when we go around Israel and we see many people who are dressed like Charedim and many people who are dressed like modern fashion, but with a kippah, with tzitzit, with the symbols of full observance of Jewish law. And if you want to give them a title, you can call them modern Orthodox or religious Zionist if it's a knit kippah head cover here in Israel. So of course it's things that are very interesting, and I'm sure your tourists will find them with many parallels also to the culture he comes from. As we said in the beginning, most of the world is monotheistic. The world does not agree on the main book or the upgraded, the relevant book of Revelation, and then the world will also argue on how do we interpret the book? How do we fulfill our religious commitments? How do we fulfill our faith? That is, in every religion, an argument. And what we need to understand is that every tourist, every person belonging to one of these streams of Judaism is in the understanding that they are choosing the way of the best fulfillment of God's wish in this world. They are all Jewish religion in an argument, in a discussion of how exactly do we fulfill our Judaism in the world, how involved we are, and how we balance the world we live in today and our ancient, precious Jewish identity. If we look at the Jewish world, the main population is in two places. Israel, number one, about 6 million Jews, and about 5.5 million in the United States. And if you add Canada, it's already coming very close to Israel. The next after the United States is France, which is getting smaller and smaller. In other words, there are two centers of Jewish population in the world. And if we go to the center in the United States, where most of the Jewish tourists come from, to Israel, and ask the question of Jewish affiliation and denomination, in some statistics it's even the larger. And also over here you'll see no denomination or other, what we call unaffiliated. That will be the largest group of Jews, usually with a very little kind of participation in Jewish life. It can be in the identity Jewish, but the knowledge of Judaism and active participation will be pretty low. They also, though, if we want to celebrate a bar mitzvah or to have a trip once or twice in a lifetime to understand more of my Jewish identity, they'll definitely come and will be very eager to learn more about Judaism. When they will go to synagogue on a high holiday or join a group, it will usually be a Reform group, which is the most inclusive one to different perspectives. Among religious Jews in the United States, the largest group is Reform Judaism by far. This is, of course, self-definition. Where would you feel most comfortable? So Reform Judaism that we described is the most popular, after conservative, and after the conservative, Orthodox only 10%. Orthodox means here both what we call modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. In the United States, the difference is very little. Since the issues that are in Israel, do you work, do you serve in the army, are non-issues in the United States. Everybody has to go to college, has to go to university, has to get a good profession, and be part of a modern world in order to make a living, and they're all committed to halakha. So the distinction between Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, and modern Orthodox in the States is usually not there in the statistics. And of course it's a minority. The likelihood of you to guide Orthodox Jews is high if you're an Orthodox Jew and low if you're not. Usually Orthodox Jews will prefer to have an Orthodox guide. Not always, but usually. Therefore, if you're not an Orthodox viewer right now, and you're going to guide Jews, the high likelihood is that they are either unaffiliated, Reform, or conservative. And when you guide liberal Jews, you need to fit the messages of guiding, and where you go to eat, and where you offer to go to synagogue, to pray on Shabbat, accordingly to the self-definition. And it's something we usually find out in the small talk. Do you belong to a congregation? Oh yeah, interesting. It's enough that we'll say temple, and it's already Reform, because temple is a Reform already from the 19th century. The first temple was 1817, but it is a reformed term for a synagogue, saying the temple is wherever we worship. That is the holy place. We don't need to spend our life longing for a place that is destroyed for 2,000 years. But also in a little small talk, usually if someone belongs to a congregation, it will come up, and you can understand, and many times you know in advance, what is the set of values, what we're interested in seeing, hearing. So we talked about the Jewish self-definition and different denominations in the United States, in the world Jewry, and back here, what's going on? Of course, that is also a question that many people are curious about, and there's a lot of misconception and also ignorance about the religious definitions in Israel, which are very different than the religious Jewish definitions in the States in many ways. So really, in just a few minutes, to talk about what we have here. The largest group in Israel is the secular. The self-definition of secular is 45% of the Jewish population in Israel. But when we say secular and someone who lives outside of Israel says secular, it's totally different things, because the secular Jew is very Jewish by culture. When someone in the States would say secular, you wouldn't think of someone celebrating all the Jewish holidays, or at least many of them, often making kiddush, celebrating Shabbat and a family festive meal. So Hebrew, knowledge of Tanakh, of Jewish sources, Jewish text. So it is a very Jewish life, culturally. Doesn't have to be, but it often is. And that is different than what we would usually refer to as secular in English. You don't even have to be atheist in order to define yourself secular in Israel, since the term secular relates to and opposes to many times the perspective of religion in Israel. Another thing, or another way to define secular would be culturally Jewish and not religiously Jewish. So that is 45%, and of course it's all generalizations. Not all of them are culturally Jewish, but as we said, many are, and it's something that is a different perspective, different self-definition, but is not as well known in the States. The next self-definition we will talk about is even less known in the States, traditional, in Hebrew, masorti. The term masorti was also adopted in Hebrew by the conservative movement, but there's nothing to do by the self-definition masorti in Israel and conservative. It just happens to be the same name. Masorti, self-definition, usually will be by Jews coming from Muslim countries, what we call Mizrahi or Sephardi Jews, and very high respect to tradition, strong faith, but not full commitment to Jewish law. Respect to Jewish law, and usually it will be towards the Orthodox Jewish law. And when synagogue is celebrated, it will be with men and women separate, and men will be leading the prayer, and very important to have kiddush, to go to synagogue once a week usually, not eat pork. But there's still a sense of self-flexibility in what you choose to obey, and there are commandments that are considered that you'd never violate, and commandments that are more flexible. The flexibility is both in the life of an individual. Many times a Masorti Jew will start off as a kid and partying on Friday night, going out, going to a soccer game, and being less strict, taking more responsibility after marriage and children for the sake of good education, but often still driving on Shabbat for trips and going to the sea, to the beach and stuff like that. And often as an older person, at the age of losing a parent, and then going to say the Kaddish in synagogue 3 times a day, becoming more a part of a learning and praying community of a synagogue, and becoming more and more religious, and then maybe even changing the definition from Masorti to Dati. So there's a flexibility within families and within the individual life of observance, and very high respect and high faith. And very simple faith many times, very clear that the Torah is true. Faith in God, and an understanding that there is a flexibility in how much you take upon yourself in every stage of your life. 16% would define themselves Dati, religious, which is modern Orthodox, and full. It's a self-definition of full observance of halakha in the Orthodox meaning of halakha, and 14% Haredi that we talked about earlier. Proportions that are very interesting, and very important to share, because often there'll be misconceptions regarding where you are. Of course, the situation in Jerusalem and the situation in Tel Aviv and the situation in Bnei Brak are very different, and learning about Israeli society, the Jewish and the non-Jewish part, is part of what makes the journey in Israel so fascinating. And that is what we introduce also to the tourist. And maybe some of these options they'll find even more appealing and interesting as they are going through their inner journey in their self-definition and identity. And also the learning can be always mutual. That at least would be what I hope for an experience of a meeting, of an encounter between the tourist and the wonderful cultures and philosophies that we have over here. And if we think, for example, if you're in Tel Aviv with liberal Jews, they love many times to go to Bet Daniel, or Reform Synagogue in Ramat Aviv, or to the port in the summer. There's a musical Kabbalat Shabbat, hundreds of people on the beach, which is a very spiritual, very beautiful. It's called Bet Tfilah Israeli. They have also a synagogue, and also in the summer they are on Pier 14 in the port of Tel Aviv. And you would offer things like that, showing you understand what they're looking for spiritually and how they worship, and you respect it, which they cannot take for granted in Israel, unfortunately. As conservative and reform Jewish communities and religion does not get the same, and that will be an understatement, privileges that Orthodox Judaism gets here, and they feel very discriminated. They know that Israelis know very little about them, not educated, and not respectful. In Jewish law, their emancipation and equality between religions in Israel is not viewed as one that includes and is inclusive for either reform or conservative Judaism that are united in fighting for rights here in Israel. So that is also something to be aware of as regarding these kinds of groups. In the Kotel, which is a huge issue, it was defined as the issue of the year by the Reform movement. The space designated for liberal Judaism is called Ezrat Israel. It is not as well equipped as the Orthodox section. No chairs, very limited access to the wall itself. But you need to be aware of it and to offer it as if we want to have our service together, egalitarian, led, and as you wish as a community, and then maybe come to the main prayer plaza. It is an option that is very important to be aware of. So, after these few words about what is the Jewish world today, what do we expect? And it's clear that in these minutes, yeah, I know it may seem longer, but in this time of a very brief lecture about different Jewish philosophies of our times, it is not enough. So if you know that you don't know, and that you are going to guide Jewish groups, make an effort and learn more, so you can understand them and give them the best service and respect, and really succeed in the mission of creating a good, positive experience of connection to this land. So with this, we end our journey that started from the book of Genesis and followed the Jewish timeline all the way to our times. From now on, the next chapters will not be on a chronological order, but talk about topics that are things we need to explain about the Jewish culture we see, about the Jewish religion we see. So if we got a little too philosophical, don't worry, the next chapter will be far more practical. And until then, have a great time, a great day, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.